Hey there, everyone. Pastor Paul here, and I'm hoping that you've had a good first couple of weeks of life groups and some great discussions about our sermon series and life group discussions about everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. We've talked about many different things connected to this sermon series, but we've missed one specific area. Do you know what that is? Well, let me share a couple images with you to better help you see what we are going to talk about today. Now, I want to warn you, a few of you might squirm a little bit with what I'm about to show you. Oh, it's nothing gory or R-rated or anything, but from my many years of pastoring, there are some people who don't like to see or think about these images. The first one, many of you should recognize because many of you have been in this building. Yep. That's one of the funeral homes in town. As you see this building, or as you think about what's in it, do any of you get a little nervous? Okay, how about this image? Anyone recognize where this is? Yep, it's Mount Pisgah Cemetery up the street here in Gillette. I know there are a few of you who do not like cemeteries, maybe because you watched too many horror movies growing up. I don't know. Okay, here's another image. What stirs some people up with this image? Yeah, it's a room of caskets. Don't worry, no one's lying in them. At least I don't think they're full. And for any hunters in the room, I just gotta throw this cool one in. Yeah, you wanna be buried in that one? That gets your heart pumping, doesn't it? Now I know for some of you, these images don't stir many emotions. But for some of you, they do. Possibly because you recently were at a funeral for a loved one, and those feelings and emotions are still fresh. Maybe for some of you, your emotions are worked up because of the unknown. You never went to a funeral, and the only images of a funeral or a person who died is what you've seen in the movies. And if that's all you know, yeah, there might be reason for concern. Others of you may be worked up for other reasons. Maybe just because the word death worries you. Based upon my experience, we have a lot of emotions and feelings, and yes, for some of you, fears when it comes to facing death. And these images are all images associated with death. So we can get a little stirred up. And truthfully, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we want to face it or not, we will all face death. We'll all face it, someone we know, probably a loved one at some point, dying. It's going to happen. And we all, unless Jesus decides to do the end of the world thing in the near future, we will all face our own death. The writer of Psalm 39 was fully aware of this as he reflects in verses 4 and 5. Lord, remind me how brief my time on earth will be. Remind me that my days are numbered, how fleeting my life is. You have made my life no longer than the width of my hand. My entire lifetime is just a moment to you. At best, each of us is but a breath. For this writer, death is an obvious part of life. Okay, so I might have stirred up some initial emotions in you and your group. So before we go on, I want you to pause the video and talk through what each of you are going through in your hearts. Listen well to each other and recognize that you all might be at different places in how you feel and why you feel as you do with all of these thoughts and images. I've included a couple questions to get you started. Then come back as we will see what might help us as we face these thoughts and emotions and fears. You know, other than cutting the grass for a lady down the street from me, do you know what my very first official job was back as a teenager? It was working in a funeral home. Yeah, I didn't realize at the time that it would be good for me when I became a pastor. What did I do with my job? Well, I cleaned up a lot of flower petals after funerals. and I kept the hearses and the other cars clean. That's about it. I didn't work with any of the bodies. But I also got to see how funeral directors and pastors could be such a blessing to those dealing with some of those feelings and emotions that many of you just talked through. One of my favorite moments as a pastor in helping people reflect upon some of these emotions that we have when we consider death, especially our own deaths, was the time I did something a little radical on an Easter morning. At least many people I've talked to since have said it was a little radical. I brought a casket into the sanctuary. Yes, a casket in church on an Easter morning. And no one knew about it except my wife, the funeral director, and the worship leader. So you can imagine as people started coming into worship on that Easter morning, expecting everything to be all cheery and exciting, but to find the casket up front and closed. There were a lot of people whispering and nervous. You could really feel the tension in the room. I had the worship leader play something a little differently than normal for an Easter morning, something more somber to set the mood. Then I walked up, stood right next to the casket, and I invited about 10 people to come up front to stand around the casket with me. A couple of them came excitedly, wanting to see what was going to happen. But a few came with some fear on their faces because they weren't sure what was about to happen. And with those emotions, along with all of the other emotions in the room, I went on then to talk about the emotions on that first Easter morning when the ladies were heading to the tomb to take care of Jesus' dead body. Many of those emotions for those ladies were the same as those people standing around the casket would have had. But then I talked about what they found when they got to the tomb. They came expecting to find a dead body. But instead, and at that moment, I opened the casket, of course, to find it was empty, just like what those women found at the tomb. And I simply said, "He is alive." You should have seen the faces of those people standing there as they experienced the excitement of the resurrection. Death doesn't win. And that excitement, as they all turned with their faces beaming to face the others in the congregation and to begin to share the news, he's alive. What a powerful moment of worship, and then a whole morning of worship that was. Here it is 15 years later, and I can still remember the joy on everyone's faces as we celebrated the resurrection that day. You see, when we face our own deaths and other people's deaths with the hope of the resurrection, it changes some of those emotions. It can take some of those anxious emotions and fears and turn them into a sense of peace. And yes, even joy. And the way we cast out those fears and bad emotions, well, it's love. It's the love that God shares with us through the story of Jesus. The disciple John, who had seen the love of God and witnessed the story up close and personal, had this to say about how God's love through this story can change us. It's one of the letters that John wrote, 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 16, where we read, "God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And as we live in God, our love grows more perfect. So we will not be afraid on the day of judgment, but we can face him with confidence because we live like Jesus here in this world. Such love has no fear because perfect love expels all fear." You see, John both knew the story of what happened with the death and the resurrection of Jesus, but John also knew of the loving words that Jesus shared with the disciples to help prepare them for what was about to take place. One part of those words that Jesus shared right before he died in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, they're so good that they happen to be the words that I share the most out of any Bible passage at funerals. When a family is not sure of what words out of the Bible that would be good for that day, when they're having a funeral service, I'll usually mention and read these words. And when I do, you can see comfort come over their faces. You see, those words that people in the moment, as they hear Jesus' words about death and life, they experience God's love being shared with them. And that love, which is perfect, begins casting out that fear and anxiousness of what they're facing both in this death that they're dealing with and, truthfully, their own mortality too. What are those words of Jesus that John shares? They go like this. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am. As Jesus shares these loving thoughts with his disciples and with us, I almost picture a parent dropping off their young child at school, that scary big school with all of those unknowns each day, and the parent saying to the child, "Don't worry, I'll be back at the end of the day for you. I will take you home again where everything is okay." Jumping then to verse 18, Jesus keeps loving us and assuring us that all will be okay. He says, "No, I will not abandon you as orphans. I will come to you. Soon the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Since I live, you also will live. When I'm raised to life again, you will know that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you." Can you hear those words of assurance that ring out from Jesus? I've got you. If you're connected to me, then I am connected to you, and therefore you have nothing to worry about. And that's how he finishes these words with those disciples and with us. He helps us to know about what we can feel and what we should feel as we move forward with his words resting on our hearts. Jumping to verse 27, he says, "I am leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled or afraid. Remember what I told you. I am going away, but I will come back to you again. If you really loved me, you would be happy that I'm going to the Father who is greater than I am. I have told you these things before they happen, so that when they do happen, you will believe." We all have different kinds of fears and anxious thoughts. For some of us, our own deaths and the deaths of others is one of those things that make us squirm. But Jesus says, "I love you, and I am with you, and I will take you home when that time comes. So fear not." Discuss through some of the other questions that I have for you, and if you want, I share another passage that I use regularly at funerals. Maybe you want to peek into that passage if time permits, to see what words of comfort God has in there as well. Be blessed, and I will see you on Sunday.